Now that we've been on a tour of the soil test lab, we need to remind ourselves exactly what those soil test results are used for. They're there to tell farmers exactly how much nutrients are in the soil so that the farmer can make better decisions about how much fertilizer and what kind of fertilizer to apply to the soil. And the best way to get an idea of how those soil test results are actually used is to talk to a farmer, and that's what we're going to do now. This is Dr. Rodney Jones. He's not only a friend of mine, a colleague in the Department of Ag Econ at Oklahoma State, but he's a farmer. And he allowed us to take a soil sample from one of his fields, run it through the soil test lab. I have the results here, and we're going to talk about what the results mean for him and his farm. First, Rodney, tell us a little bit about your farm overall and this field in particular.
Okay, well, our farm, my wife and I farm together in Garfield County, Oklahoma, just south of Enid there, and the base of that farming operation is probably what my wife's parents and grandparents built over multiple generations. We've added to that a little bit, but our farm is primarily a farm that originated with my wife's family. This particular field that we sampled for you is a farm that's been in her family for multiple generations. I don't think it's quite a centennial farm, but it would be close. And it's a typical north central Oklahoma farm, kind of some hillsides, a hilltop, and then some bottom ground on that particular farm. Been in wheat for most of the time that it's been farmed, but here recently we've been trying to do a little bit of crop rotation on that particular farm.
Okay. And most of the time, am I right, when you get a soil test back, the most important thing is the nitrogen content of the soil. Is that right?
Nitrogen would be probably the most primary nutrient that we would look at. Nitrogen's kind of a funny nutrient in that it is one of the more critical nutrients and one of the more important nutrients that we know we need for every crop, but it also is a little bit forgiving in that you have several different opportunities throughout the growing season to adjust your nitrogen levels.
Not just once a year. Gotcha. Now, the results came back. It said nitrogen was deficient. They suggested adding 28 pounds of nitrogen per acre. First off, is this normal, and are you expecting to follow their recommendations?
Yes, Bailey. This soil test was taken in the middle of the winter, and this was a wheat crop. So this was after the wheat had been planted and was up and established, but before it really took off and started growing in the spring. That would be a pretty typical expected soil test result for our particular farm, the way we manage our nitrogen for that time of the year, because we tend to put on about roughly 2/3 of our expected needs in the fall before we would plant a wheat crop, and then expect to what we would call top dress the remainder of that nitrogen on that growing crop in the spring of the year. So, we would expect to need about 100 pounds of total nitrogen for
every year
to grow a 50 bushel wheat crop. And so we would have put on or had available about 65 or 70 pounds of that in the fall of the year, with the expectation that we would need to add somewhere close to another 30 pounds of actual in the spring of the year.
And when you said side dress, what do you mean?
We mean just going over the top of the wheat with some kind of a nitrogen product that we would just distribute out there on the ground before the wheat really starts to take off and get big in the spring.
And it's in a liquid form then, right?
We could use either dry or liquid.
Okay.
Could use whatever is most convenient for the particular operation. On our farm, we do use a lot of liquid because we have a nice spray rig to apply it with, but a lot of people use a dry spreader, and they would just use a different nitrogen product.
Right. Next to nitrogen, farmers are often most interested in the phosphorus and potassium. First, do you have to apply phosphorus and potassium every year?
On our farm, we do. The plants obviously use a little bit of phosphorus and potassium every year. I take that back. We don't normally apply potassium because our soils are fairly rich in potassium, so only in a few circumstances would we find the need to apply potassium. Phosphorus, on the other hand, we do apply every year, and we kind of base it on what we would expect the crops to take out on an annual basis, and then adjust that a little bit based on soil test recommendations. If we would expect the crops to take out 20 pounds and the soil test results say we need 30 pounds, then over the course of the next year or the next couple of growing seasons, we'd add a little more than we normally would, kind of on a pre-plant basis or at planting time.
Right. Now the results did say for phosphorus it was 78% sufficient, but they recommend adding 30 pounds of phosphorus per acre. You think you'll do that or something close to it?
Yes, our normal program for most of the crops that we grow would be to put on about 20 to 25 pounds of phosphorus at planting time. Based on that soil test recommendation, we would just bump that for the next few years, or maybe do a one-time additional application. You know, I'm an economist, as you are, and if we find a time when we can buy these ingredients at an attractive price, we might just go out there and put on a little bit extra all at once, rather than spreading it out over 2 or 3 different years to build that phosphorus level.
Now you said your soils are rich in potassium, but the results suggested that you should add 24 pounds of potassium per acre.
So this is one of those farms that's the exception to the rule, one of these individual farms that's the exception to the rule in our area. And yes, we would add a little bit of potassium to that farm prior to planting.
Now, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are the main nutrients of interest. We tested for a lot of other things like sulfur, calcium, magnesium, iron, zinc, boron. How often do you test for those other nutrients?
Well, that's an interesting question, because our normal routine, I'm busy working on campus and my wife's busy, so we actually hire a crop consultant who tests all of our fields on an annual basis for nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And then what we do is we look for areas that we see some plant growth problems within a field. And then we'll go test those individual spots to see if we can figure out exactly what is the problem there. And that's what we did in this instance.
This was the soil test came from a problem spot.
This soil test came from a spot where we had noticed that plants weren't growing as aggressively and had kind of an odd color at certain times of the growing season. And so we wanted to find out a little more information, and that's very common for us to do. We will test the whole field for N, P, and K on an annual basis, and then as we see production problems in little areas, we will periodically test for the micronutrients and the other things.
And for most of those micronutrients like sulfur, magnesium, the soil test said there was plenty of those levels, but in iron they said it was deficient, and they suggested adding 2 pounds per acre. Do you think iron might be the problem in that field?
I do, and unfortunately this spring our growing conditions were not such that we could test that hypothesis or see if that result is in fact what the problem was. But I suspect, based on the soil tests, that we do have an iron problem in that location. And our intent in a normal growing season would have been to follow that recommendation and go in there and try some foliar applied or some banded micronutrients and see if those plants responded.
And foliar means right on the plant?
Just spray it on the plant.
And banded means?
Banded means put it in the ground right next to the root zone. Or put it right on top of the ground right next to the root zone, so that that plant has access to that fairly quickly, because that soil test is saying if you want to reach that yield goal this year for that crop, this plant needs some of these micronutrients fairly quickly, as opposed to just adding some to the soil for the next growing season, which is what we're going to end up doing now, because the growing season last year wasn't such that we could make that work.
And now that you said the wheat goal, we should mention something about that. When you sent in the soil test, you told them on this field you're planning on planting wheat with a yield goal of 50 bushels per acre. So all of these recommendations, they're designed, they're telling you what you need to do to get to 50 bushels per acre, right?
That's correct. And your primary limiting factor there is going to be nitrogen, and I mentioned that we can adjust that a little bit through the growing season, and there's some fabulous technologies that have come along during the growing season. For most of these plants, we can take an infrared sensor reading on that plant, and without getting into a lot of detail, if you're in a growing season where you get 3/4 of the way through the growing season and there's the potential to raise 70 bushel wheat instead of 50 bushel wheat because weather conditions have been just perfect, and et cetera, you can take a reading and it will tell you how much nitrogen you need to reach that 70 bushel yield goal, as opposed to what happened this last spring when we had other limiting factors, no rain. Your yield goal gets adjusted 3/4 of the way through the growing season to 20 or 30 bushel wheat, and then you don't put on any more nitrogen.
Now, when you said a reading, what exactly do you mean? A reading of what?
We what that is called is the nitrogen-rich strip or nitrogen-rich area technology, and it was quite honestly to a large degree developed right here at Oklahoma State University by agronomists. And what you do is you go out in a little bitty area of the field and you put on an overabundance of nitrogen. In other words, if you expect to need 100 pounds of nitrogen to raise your normal yield goal, you might put 150 pounds of nitrogen in an area no bigger than this room we're sitting in, or in a strip that just goes 150 feet across the field, maybe 10 feet wide or something. And then in the spring of the year, when that plant really starts to grow, and this spring of the year would be true for wheat, it might be a different season for a different crop, there's an NDVI sensor that you take out there that is relatively inexpensive. They're a handheld unit now, look like a mouse from a computer.
Okay.
That's what they look like.
Yeah.
And you just walk along and you sense that nitrogen-rich area, and then you sense an area in the rest of the field. And you feed that into an algorithm that is on the website right over here in the agronomy department. You feed a little bit of information in there and it will tell you what the potential is under ideal conditions that year and how much nitrogen you might need to add at top.
So you basically, you have a field, then you do a little experiment in the field.
You do an annual experiment or a per crop experiment on the fly.
And you've got a little device that tells you what that experiment means to you in that field.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's an incredible technology to a large degree developed right here at Oklahoma State University.
The pH levels of your soil came in at 7.9, and if it was 7, that would be neither alkaline nor acid, but 7.9 must have been close enough to 7 because they said the pH was adequate, no lime required. How often do you have to put lime down? When do you put lime down?
We would apply lime if needed during the time period when any one of our particular fields is not growing a crop. And a lot of times for us, that turns out to be after we've harvested a wheat crop and before we plant the next wheat crop if we're doing wheat on wheat, which is becoming more and more rare on our farm, or after we've planted a wheat crop, harvested the wheat crop and planted a subsequent double crop for the summer, raised that crop and harvested it, and then you'd have through the winter, say from December to about March or April before you planted something else. Yeah. We do a lot of our liming in that February and March time period.
If the pH is too low, right?
If the pH is too low.
Which means an acidic soil.
Which means an acidic soil. And
How often does that happen?
Well, it's becoming a real problem in Oklahoma soils. We have a lot of soils that are getting relatively low in pH. We just happened to pick a sample from a spot that was very adequate. Matter of fact, a little bit on the other side of the spectrum. But we have a lot of soils in north central Oklahoma that are getting down in the 4.5, 4.8,
very acidic.
Under 5. And when I run into a soil on our farm that is under about 5.2 or 5.3, I start to think very seriously about applying lime. On our soils that have been drawn down and been farmed pretty aggressively for the last 80, 100 years or more, we might expect to have to apply 2 tons of lime every 5 to 6 years on a particular farm. That's not all that uncommon.
Right. Now, you mentioned you hire a crop consultant to take soil tests in your field, and you work with that consultant to figure out what your fertilizer strategy should be. That's partly because you've got a full-time job in addition to be a farmer.
Absolutely.
If you were a full-time farmer, would you also hire the consultant, or do you think you do that yourself?
It depends on what expertise you feel comfortable on your particular farm. Everybody has their area of interest and their area of expertise, and somebody who happened to have an interest in agronomy, there's no reason they couldn't take on that function themselves and do that. Right. Or if they feel like they need to be spending their time doing other aspects of managing their farm, then they might very well do like what I do and hire a crop consultant. So it really would just depend on the interests and the time and the ability of the individual manager.
Right. And if the person wanted to learn how to do those things themselves, there's plenty of extension programs to help them learn how to interpret soil tests, right?
Absolutely. They could do the labor themselves, gather the information, get the soil test results back, and then very quickly go to some expertise or get some publications that would help them figure out a fertility program. Absolutely.
Now, in this course, we did a tour of the soil test laboratory. It was at Oklahoma State University, Am I right that there's one of those like in every state, no matter what state you're in, there's going to be some extension office you can call and they'll help you find a soil test laboratory?
That's correct. The Extension Service would be able to help you find a soil test laboratory, maybe in your state, maybe in a surrounding state. Not every university happens to have one, but there are private labs. There are government labs, there are university labs scattered across the United States, and your extension office would know how to get a hold of the lab that would be in closest proximity to about anyone.
Even if you're a backyard gardener.
If you're a backyard gardener, you can go to your extension office and they'll help you get a soil test taken and analyzed and help analyze the results. Absolutely.
Well, this has been great. I appreciate you helping us learn about soil tests.
Appreciate it.